Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. So I'm going to be talking today about Nigel Kneale. And there's so much that can be said about him, so I've chosen quite a specific focus, which I'll introduce in just a second. But to briefly introduce Kneale himself, so here's a picture of him when he was working on Quatermass 2, which was the second, as the name implies, of his 4 Quatermass serials. We'll be talking about 2 different ones a bit later in this talk. So he was born in 1922. He grew up on the Isle of Man, which people may know is really steeped in folklore and mythology. And his dad ran the local newspaper. So he was also very involved in media and kind of the production of media. So these 2 influences, the folkloric on the one hand and the mechanics of media production on the other, really influenced his work. And that is specifically what I'm going to be looking at today. To talk a little bit about his early life before we get to his television work, he originally trained in law, which he hated. He then began a career as a short fiction writer, and he published a book of short stories called Tomato Cane, which was recently republished by Comma Press in this beautiful edition introduced by Mark Gatiss with some additional stories that went in the original collection. It's fantastic. I highly recommend it. He then got into doing some BBC radio work, often with his short stories. And he was then offered a position at BBC Television as one of their first 2 staff writers in 1951. So it had not been that long that television had been kind of a regular feature. So it started in 1936, but then it was off air for the duration of the Second World War. And it was only really in the early 1950s that it became kind of a national medium. It was with the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II that it really became popular because that was being broadcast and people started buying or renting television sets. And it was at that time that the BBC started hiring staff writers, and Kneale was one of the first 2. So it's his television work at the BBC that we're going to focus on today. And specifically, I'm going to be talking about him as the kind of inventor of the area that I research, which I call the televisual Gothic. So I will just give a brief introduction into what that is before we go into Kneale's work. So I distinguish the televisual Gothic from Gothic television. So just to clarify what I mean by Gothic, I'm sure many of you here are very familiar with the Gothic, but for anyone who isn't or who wants a bit of orientation on specifically what we're talking about here, I broadly use Chris Baldock's definition of a fearful sense of inheritance in time combined with a claustrophobic sense of enclosure in space, these 2 dimensions reinforcing one another to produce an impression of sickening descent into disintegration. Now, I don't always use the idea of inheritance in time quite the same way as Baldock. He tends to use it in the sense of medieval history or earlier, kind of coming back to haunt characters. I kind of look at any kind of pressurized time. So it can be ancient history, much further back than that. So Kneale was very interested in very ancient prehistory, but also very recent history, and also concerns about the present and the future. And all of those concerns really can play an important role in Kneale's work. So Helen Wheatley defines Gothic television as a domestic form of a genre which is deeply concerned with the domestic, writing stories of unspeakable family secrets and homely trauma large across the television screen. So she's really interested in the domestic reception of television, whereas with the televisual Gothic, I am more interested in the industrial production of television. So the other end of the kind of transmission process. So Geoffrey Sconce, in his great book, Haunted Media, talks about this idea of self-reflexive meditations on the viewer's potentially dangerous relationship to this new technology. He's talking about television here, and the phantom worlds it evoked. But again, I'm slightly moving away from this definition. So this kind of idea of technophobic anxiety, fear of the technology itself, and the idea that it might provide a kind of a conduit for malevolent forces. We see that in things like the film Poltergeist, people might be familiar with. Whereas I am particularly interested in the human mechanics of television production, and that being used as a source of horror or terror. So, as Kneale himself said, it is television about television. And this was something that he did a lot of. Television features quite prominently in a lot of his television work. And so we're going to look at 4 examples of that today. So, firstly, the Quatermass experiment. This was the programme that really made Kneale's name. So this was, as you can see, a couple of years after he began his contract at the BBC, and it follows Professor Bernard Quatermass, who we can see on the left of the image here, who is the head of the British Experimental Rocket Group. They launch a rocket into orbit with 3 astronauts on board. It veers, of course, and when it comes back to Earth, there is only 1 astronaut left on board, Victor Carroon, who we see in the centre of this image here. We also see to his other side Judith Carroon, his wife, who is also a scientist on the team. What then follows is this kind of exploration of kind of alien invasion, but with a twist. So it is a kind of invisible kind of alien entity that mutates, and it absorbs organic matter and combines it and mutates it. So it combines human bodies and then combines them with other species of animal, with plant matter, with fungus. And it ends with this kind of apocalyptic scene at Westminster Abbey. So it's this kind of climax that I want to particularly talk about. Unfortunately, it's not possible to see this episode. There were 6 episodes and only the first 2 were recorded. The way that television was recorded then was that the monitor that was showing the live transmission was recorded with another camera, and the quality was very low. There was a planned export to Canada that didn't go ahead, and so only the first 2 were recorded. But you can get hold of the scripts. There has also been a film adaptation by Hammer, which I'll talk a bit about later. There was a live remake by the BBC in 2005, and a couple of years ago, there was a live production at Alexandra Palace where the programme was broadcast from, which was produced by a good friend of mine, John Deere, who attended an earlier session. But it's this final episode that I want to talk a bit about. So during the kind of climax at Westminster Abbey, a diegetic broadcast is in progress, unrelated to the events. So it is just kind of a history, art, culture programme that this alien invasion interrupts. And this is then described as an outside broadcast of the end of the world, which is where I got my title for today's class from. Kneale was really interested here in the way that people respond to television. So there is a scene where characters see that crowds are gathering, big crowds, hundreds of cars, and the explanation given for this is that 1 million people saw it on their television sets. So you get this idea here of television directly influencing people's behaviour. So they're either trying to flee the city or they're coming for a closer look because of what they've seen on television. So this idea of television sparking interest in real events. And I'm just going to leave that thought with people because we're going to come back to a very different take on this when we talk about our next text. Quatermass then goes onto the broadcast to kind of communicate the situation to the masses, and he says, oh, the fact anything more than that people must find in them of television to tell people the truth. I'm just going to leave this here for now because your mind. But for now, so Hutchings writes that this Westminster Abbey setting would have had a particular resonance for the television audience who only a few months previously had witnessed the same location on their screens during the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. There's a kind of iconoclasm here, a furtive pleasure in seeing the Queen supplanted by a deadly alien monster about to reproduce. In actual fact, it was only a few weeks previously that the coronation had been broadcast. And I think this is a great reading, but I think it's also really interesting that Kneale chooses not just, this scene that is kind of associated with national celebration and unity, but also one that is associated with television. So many people watching this would have seen the coronation. That is probably why many people would have got their TVs in the first place or rented them. And they may well never have been to Westminster Abbey in person. And this was something that Kneale did repeatedly. So the following year, along with the director Rudolph Cartier, who he also worked on with this, they produced an adaptation of 1984, which is incredible, and I really recommend checking it out. And I just want to draw attention to this stage direction here, which says, pan slowly to model view of the Thames at Westminster. We see approximately the same area as in the TV opening signal. So Kneale was really kind of conscious of the images that television viewers were absorbing and of the capacity to generate terror by using those same images in these kind of Gothic scenes. And so he was very, very aware of his medium and its Gothic potential. Something really interesting happened during this broadcast, which was that the programme actually fell off air during the final minutes of the broadcast. And the News of the World reported that at the horrific peak, there was a loud buzzing in our sets, the screens went blank, and timorous viewers leapt to the conclusion that the thing had got the BBC already. Now, obviously, this is just one account, but I think this is so interesting that in seeing these kind of familiar signifiers, Westminster Abbey, but also seeing television equipment felt so real to people that it kind of blurred the boundaries between reality and then this kind of televisual fiction. And we see this later in things like Stephen Volk's Ghostwatch, which plays on this very deliberately. Obviously, this breakdown wasn't intentional, but I think it's really interesting that it had that effect. So then a few years later, in 1958 to 1959, he wrote the kind of third instalment in the Quatermass serial. So there's one in between called Quatermass 2, but the one I want to talk about now is Quatermass and the Pit, which is about a discovery underground in London of some kind of humanoid creatures that turn out to be ancestors of current human beings, and also this machine that is at first mistaken for a bomb and then later turns out to be a rocket ship. And it turns out that thousands of years ago, millions of years ago, Martians came to Earth, created a new hybrid species because their home planet had died, and that current humans are kind of legacy of these creatures. The kind of digging up of the site and then the bringing in of televisual technology, really importantly, kind of triggers what is described as a race memory. And so the Martians are portrayed as warlike and as obsessed with racial purity. And so it sparks kind of race riots, but it's people who are descended from these Martians attacking people who aren't. And this was something that Kneale was really concerned with. So he was married to Judith Kerr, the children's author of The Tiger Who Came to Tea and the Mog books. And she was Jewish and had escaped Nazi Germany. So Kneale was very concerned about issues around xenophobia and racial hatred and any kind of marginalization of the other. It comes up a lot in his work. So before we talk again about the final episode, and you can see all 6 episodes of this series, again, we're going to talk about the final one, which again includes a diegetic broadcast. I'm just going to play a very short clip, which is actually from the 1967 Hammer film adaptation of Quatermass and the Pit, which Kneale himself wrote. And this scene gives lots of food for thought, which we will then pull some strands out of. Copies of Colonel. So I think there's so much to discuss there. We see kind of 2 engagements with television. We see this engagement with this machine that is called the optic encephalograph that captures people's impressions in their minds and is able to record them. But then we also see this kind of mass media kind of flocking to the site of pandemonium. And this idea of, ritualized slaughter as television material, the idea that television images have the power to redirect human energy, the association of the influence of television with women, but also this kind of resistance of the kind of ultimate power of the television image. So, Quatermass himself says, if you'd been there, if you'd witnessed it. So this idea that it is not a substitution for actual experience. And so the scene that I want to really talk about actually comes kind of directly after these events. And it's a scene where kind of pandemonium breaks out that is caused by the electrical influence of all the television equipment. But then we cut between that and a scene at a pub where some characters are watching a broadcast on television. So in the original serial, the character in the pub says it's only a couple of blocks away. Why have we got to see it on that thing? But then Kneale develops this dialogue a bit for the film. So now he says, 3 streets away and we've got to see it on the telly. I tell you, people don't believe in nothing nowadays unless they've seen it on the telly. And I find this absolutely fascinating because many years later, in 1991, So there had been a hostage negotiator called Terry Waite, who, in the process of his work, had himself been taken hostage and held for 4 years. And when he was released, his cousin John Waite said, "I won't believe it until I see it on TV." So Kneale had already kind of preempted this idea of television becoming a substitute for reality. So in that sense, it's the opposite of what's happening in the Quatermass experiment, where people are coming to reality as a result of what they've seen in TV. Now it is seen to offer a substitute. And in the 50s, some people were interviewed about their experience of television. And this is a quote from one man who was interviewed who said, "The telly keeps the family together. None of us ever have to go out now." So this idea that television is in fact this kind of atomizing technology, that even though it is often advertised as creating communal experiences, it actually drives people into their separate homes. And I think we see this here. Even though people are in the pub, they're not really engaging with each other, and they kind of are completely disinterested in what's going on around them. As soon as the broadcast fails, they just are slightly annoyed and then go back to whatever they were doing before. And Guy Debord talks about this process whereby the real world is replaced by a selection of images which are projected above it, yet which at the same time succeed in making themselves regarded as the epitome of reality. And we see this quite literally here. There's a scene at the end where a kind of image of a Martian is literally projected above the city, in a very televisual sense. Susan Sontag has similarly talked about the idea that we know about the world if we accept it as the camera records it. Obviously, this is complicated here with people disbelieving the images that Quatermass has captured, he himself kind of promoting the idea of genuine experience over this kind of mediation. But we certainly see this in other characters, such as the characters at the pub. But we also get something really interesting, which is that, again, Quatermass is allowed to make a broadcast. But in this instance, so he has now become very much part of the British establishment. He is involved with the military and the government, much against his wishes. He is involved in this nuclear-based project that he is very against. But I think this is interesting because Smith writes that the impartiality of the broadcasters, the sine qua non of their continued existence, is an impartiality firmly frontiered by Parliament, which does not permit an impartiality between parliamentarianism and non-parliamentarianism, nor between views held inside and outside Parliament. And this was later enshrined in BBC policy. So he writes that in its internal document, Principles and Practice in News and Current Affairs, one of the main texts of broadcasting practice, the BBC maintains that it is its express duty to uphold parliamentary life. And we see this here. We get this character, Colonel Breen, saying that the duty is to quiet public alarm, and Quatermass is kind of pressured to conform to that kind of goal of maintaining parliamentary power and authority, which again is very against kind of the greater freedom that he had in the Quatermass experiment to speak freely to people. So you can already see Kneale becoming quite cynical about television here. And he would become even more cynical in the year of the Sex Olympics, which was aired in 1960. And I'm just going to show a quick clip from that now. Okay, so the year of the Sex Olympics is about this divided society that revolves around television. So we have the high drives who produce it to control the low drives who consume it. So it is all mindless entertainment that revolves around sex or food or very minor violence. And this is interrupted by this event whereby a man trying to kind of protest against this kind of regime of enforced banality falls to his death. And we have seen a very unresponsive, low drive audience throughout, but they now kind of erupt into raucous laughter. The consequence of which is that the protagonists, who we see on screen here, are permitted to leave the island on the condition that they are broadcast 24/7, but they are essentially tortured for the entertainment of the low drives back home now that the producers have seen the impact that extreme violence and death has on them. And I think this is just unbelievably prescient for many reasons. So I just love this quote from Mark Gatiss, who wrote in his obituary to Nigel Kneale, "When Big Brother began on Channel 4 in 2000, I took a principled stand against it. Don't they know what they're doing? I screamed at the TV. It's the year of the Sex Olympics. Nigel Kneale was right." And it really is amazing that he really did preempt this idea of the 24-hour broadcast and the putting people into a contained space and producing a reality show from it. It's quite amazing, really. But there was already a history of reality television. It had actually been kind of pioneered by the Nazi regime. So as Erwin writes, Adolf Hitler and the Nazis were working on a Big Brother-style cable television propaganda industry to be broadcast across Germany. Orwellian screens would have been set up in public places and would show people's television depicting how the Aryan race should live. So reality television has always had a very dark history. And as I say, Kneale was very, very concerned about the impact of fascism. But it also speaks to kind of contemporary economic trends. So it preempts this neoliberal move from an author-led to a consumer-led model, which included ratings and audience share. So this is the idea that you collect data on what audiences are watching and just feed them more of the same to keep them watching. And in this instance, it's not so much for totalitarian control as to just make money by being able to screen more adverts to bigger audiences. But as Cook points out, by asking audiences what they like with a view to giving them more of it, the possibility is denied of giving the audience something beyond their experience, something they did not know they wanted. And I think Kneale was very concerned about how this kind of television could impact on creativity. Neil Postman has a fantastic book on television and its dangers called Amusing Ourselves to Death, but he actually defends quote-unquote trash television. He says that the best things on television are its junk and no one and nothing is seriously threatened by it. And I think Kneale really saw that that wasn't necessarily the case. And he was quite right. There have now been 40 recorded suicides linked to participation in reality television. So quote unquote junk has just as much capacity to cause harm as more kind of highbrow forms of broadcasting that might cause other risks like disinformation. Reality TV has also been recorded as using actual torture methods, so techniques that are recognised by the UN as torture, including sleep deprivation, isolation, taunting, food deprivation, and pushing of alcohol consumption. And as Wallace identifies, we are culpable for this. So she says, we cheer, we laugh, we watch. And I think we really see that in this clip, that Kneale really saw, the capacity for this kind of audience engagement. And she then argues that just as the slave trade depended on having people willing to buy the slaves, the reality TV shows depend on having audiences willing to watch. We are complicit. And as long as we're willing consumers of the product, the torture will continue, both for viewers who have increasingly fewer options in terms of what to watch, and for those hapless souls who sign up for a dream and end up in a nightmare. And again, I think this was something that Kneale was very concerned with. And I think we really see that in this and also in his later work, The Stone Tape, which we'll talk about shortly. So when Neil Postman asks, who is prepared to take arms against a sea of amusements? What is the antidote to a culture's being drained by laughter? Then I would suggest that Kneale is prepared to take arms and that perhaps the televisual Gothic might provide an antidote. So I am now going to talk finally about the Stone Tape. So the Stone Tape is about a group of researchers called Ryan Electrics, headed by Peter Brock, who we see on screen here. He's joined here with his lover and the computer programmer, the only female member of the team, Jill. They are sent to this old country manor to develop a new recording medium, and they discover that a room is supposedly haunted, but it turns out that the stone itself has recorded this woman's death in the 19th century, and that it has the capacity to record traumatic events. And I'm just going to show a brief scene here of some of the characters reacting to their discoveries. So again, I think there is so much we could pull out of this, perhaps particularly this another prediction of Kneale's, which I think is the kind of misogynistic tech bro that we see here, but this real focus on violence in television production and aggression. But there's also a few kind of more specific points that I want to pull out. So, by this time, television was, as Johnson says, a ubiquitous but ephemeral medium. So it's a very different context to Kneale's early work. Rather than being this kind of strange alien entity, it was now very commonplace. Most households contained a television. And so Kneale kind of introduces a kind of restranging of television production into a culture that has now become very used to it. This is also, a time where technology was really being valued above content and the art of television. So as Jacobs writes, tapes in space were more valuable than the preservation of television programs. So I think we really see this echoed in kind of the way that the ghost in question, who we see in the background here, Louisa, who was a maid in the 19th century, her suffering is completely dismissed. And as we see, she is totally erased from the tape through Peter's kind of violent actions to command and control her kind of unconscious spirit. So I think this was something Kneale was very concerned with. A lot of his work was not preserved, and I think he was quite anxious about this kind of elevation of the technology over the creativity, the creative work. So Mark Fisher has written about the stone tape brilliantly, and he writes that what the haunting phenomenon offers is the possibility not only of a new recording medium, but of a new player, the human nervous system itself. A totally wireless communication system, transmissions beamed directly into your head, a breakdown of the distinction between the player and what is being played. And again, I think this is incredibly prescient of Kneale in terms of how we now engage with television. So Eurykio writes that television's ongoing change seems endless, from tubes to transistors to chips, from cathode ray displays to plasma to projection, from broadcast to cable to internet streaming, from dial-up to remote control to algorithmic recommendation, from mass audiences to niche audiences to individuals. So even though we're not quite at the point of being able to have kind of personalized experiences, so some of the characters are more sensitive to than others. So some people don't pick up anything, some only pick up the sound. Some people, like Jill, see quite explicit visual images. And so we haven't quite reached that point. But those of us who access television through the internet will have in terms of her economic status and also in terms of her gender. And this is something that we still see playing out. So there's a great book by Shoshana Zuboff called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And she is talking here about Google's rollout of urban planning, so things like Google Earth, and how they installed several hundred free internet-enabled kiosks in New York City, ostensibly to combat the problem of digital inequality. So they were promoting it as, here, if you can't afford the internet at home, you can access it for free here. But of course, the reason that they did that was so that they could gather data from these people who they didn't previously have access to. So it is about access to vulnerable people, not access for them. And I think we see this in the stone tape. So the reason that I talk about this in the context, again, of reality television is that if the Ryan Electric's team were able to harness this technology, and they don't succeed in that, luckily, but if they be able to, these recordings are only made when someone experiences trauma. So they could only produce recordings of real traumatic experiences, which is, again, the kind of prediction of reality television that we see in the year of the Sex Olympics. And as Wood and Skeggs writes, there is an overrepresentation of the working class in reality television precisely because of their cultural and economic situation. So this idea that because if people have fewer options, they're more desperate for money, they're more desperate for support. Famously, the Jeremy Kyle show would promise access to things like therapy and rehabilitation that weren't otherwise accessible, then they are more vulnerable to this genre. Calvert also identifies that we are in an increasingly voyeuristic society in which we like to watch other people's private lives and revealing moments, but often care little for actually interacting with them. And I think we really see this in how the Ryan Electrics team, except Jill, interact with Louisa. So even though she's not conscious, Jill is very distressed by her distress, and the men are not interested at all. They're just excited by this technological possibility. Claire Cronin then says that we want the dead to suffer for our pleasure, sorry, typo there, to continue to perform their deaths in excruciating loops because we find the spectacle of this idea thrilling. And further, that the genre of paranormal reality TV has been a huge success, but it's not one that the dead can profit from. But here I think we also see this in terms of class, which is a very real phenomenon, this idea of putting poor people in humiliating and very distressing situations for the entertainment of others. We see that in how the characters respond to this ghost of Louisa. We also see this in things like the treatment of contestants on the Jeremy Kyle show, which led to its cancellation. So again, I think Kneale was hugely prescient here. So I just want to finish up with this quote from Kneale, and this was a quote that he gave to my friend Andy Murray, who is his biographer. And he says, I've seen through quite an exciting time when things change from the beginning of television to almost the extinction of it. What the next stage will be, I wouldn't dare guess. It may replace everything from books to films. It's lying in wait for us now. And I think we're already seeing, the impact of the internet, of social media, of things like AI. And we can really, I think, see a continuation of exactly the kind of issues that Kneale was talking about. So again, I think he was very prescient here. So just to finish up, a few recommendations for further reading and watching if you're interested. So there is this new collection, Nigel, Kneale and Horror, which I have a chapter in on the televisual Gothic in Kneale's work. Also, Into the Unknown is the Kneale biography that I just mentioned by Andy Murray. Another of my friends, Toby Haydock, just released this fantastic book, The Quatermass Experiment, which is a behind-the-scenes look at the making of the Quatermass Experiment. It's absolutely fascinating. And finally, Hammer have just re-released their adaptations of the Quatermass Experiment and Quatermass 2 with lots of special features, including a documentary that I am on and a commentary for Quatermass 2 that I did with my friend John Diaz. So some shameless self-promotion and friend promotion there. But if you're interested, I would recommend all of them, obviously with some bias, but I genuinely think they are all great. So I'm just going to very quickly show my bibliography. I'm just going to leave it on screen for a second so people can have a look at it on the recording. And then a few more there. And I will stop there and leave some time for questions.